In the vast expanse of the Andromeda spiral, where stars burned like scattered diamonds against the cosmic void, there existed a truth as old as time itself. Predators ruled. They had always ruled. For 700 standard cycles, since the first primitive species crawled from their homeworlds and reached for the stars, the galaxy had operated under one immutable law: the strong devoured the weak. The Kethmori, whose name translated roughly to "those who harvest," had perfected this art beyond mere survival. They were evolution's masterpiece of destruction, standing 9 feet tall on digitigrade legs that could propel them across terrain at speeds that shattered the sound barrier. Their obsidian black carapaces gleamed with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed with their heartbeats, and their 4 arms ended in claws capable of rending steel. But it was their minds that made them truly terrifying. Cold, calculating, patient as the void itself. For centuries they had swept across star systems like a plague of intelligent locusts. The Veltari had fallen first, a peaceful species of crystalline beings, whose cities sang with harmonic frequencies. The Kethmori had learned to appreciate that music before silencing it forever. The Zephnol followed, their gas giant cities becoming hunting grounds where the screams echoed through methane storms. Dozens of civilizations had been consumed, their technologies assimilated, their populations processed. But the Kethmori were not mindless beasts. They were artists of war, philosophers of pain. They understood that fear was a tool more powerful than any weapon, that hope was a luxury to be rationed and then extinguished. They ruled not through chaos, but through the elegant precision of absolute dominance. Hide Huntress Zarathik stood on the command deck of the harvester ship Bone of Worlds, her 4 arms spread wide as she gazed upon the tactical display before her. The hologram showed their latest prize, a small, blue-green world orbiting a yellow star in a previously uncharted system. Intelligence reports indicated a relatively young species, barely 3,000 cycles old, that had only recently achieved primitive spaceflight. "Another garden world," rumbled Huntmaster Crixtel, his voice like grinding stone. "The inhabitants call themselves humans." The word felt strange on his mandibles, alien and somehow unsettling. Zaratek's secondary eyes, the smaller pair that tracked movement with predatory precision, focused on the data streams flowing across her neural interface. "Show me their combat capabilities." The display shifted, revealing primitive vessels that barely qualified as starships, chemical propulsion, crude armor plating, weapons that fired solid projectiles. Zarathek's throat sacs inflated with what passed for laughter among her kind. "They still fight with kinetic weapons," she mused, her primary eyes never leaving the blue world below. "How? Quaint. Begin standard harvesting protocols. I want population centers mapped, resistance capabilities assessed, and extraction sites prepared. We'll make this quick. I have no desire to linger over such primitive prey." But Velvac, the ship's intelligence analyst, raised one clawed appendage in hesitation. Unlike his warrior caste superiors, Velvac belonged to the scholar caste. Smaller, more cerebral, bred for analysis rather than killing, his bioluminescent patterns flickered with uncertainty. "Hide Huntress," he began carefully, "there are anomalies in the data." Zarathik's head rotated 80 degrees to face him, a motion that would have snapped the neck of most species. "Elaborate." "The humans appear to have originated from what we would classify as a Class 12 death world." Velithac's fingers danced across his control interface, bringing up environmental data. Gravity nearly twice galactic standard. Atmospheric composition hostile to most carbon-based life. Predator-to-prey ratios that should have prevented the evolution of sentient life entirely. "All the more reason to end this quickly," Crixter growled. "Deathworlders are unpredictable. Better to sterilize the system and move on." But Zarathik was studying the data more carefully now. Something about the humans' development patterns struck her as wrong. They had achieved spaceflight too quickly for a species of their apparent age. Their population distribution suggested a coordination that bordered on the impossible for primitive beings. And their manufacturing capabilities. "How many humans are there?" she asked quietly. "Approximately 8 billion on the homeworld alone," Velvac replied, "with colonies established on 16 different worlds within their local system cluster. The command deck fell silent. In 700 cycles of hunting, the Kethmori had never encountered a species that had spread so far so quickly. Most civilizations took millennia to establish even a single off-world colony. These humans had done it in a fraction of that time. Perhaps, Zarathak said slowly, we should observe them more closely before we begin the harvest. Light years away, in the sterile corridors of Luna Station, Admiral Sarah Chen was experiencing what the medical staff politely called another episode. The nightmares had been getting worse. Visions of ships falling like burning stars, of colonies going dark one by one, of distress signals that cut off mid-transmission. The psychologist said it was post-traumatic stress from the Titan incident. Sarah knew better. She had been tracking the pattern for 3 years now, correlating disappearances across the Outer Rim territories. Entire settlements vanishing without a trace. Trade routes suddenly going silent. The colonial authority blamed equipment failures, navigation errors, the usual hazards of deep space exploration. But Sarah had seen the evidence they refused to acknowledge: burn patterns that didn't match any known weapon, wreckage with structural damage that suggested feed. Admiral? The voice belonged to Lieutenant Marcus Webb, her aide-de-camp and one of the few people who didn't treat her like a fragile relic of humanity's expansion wars. The Security Council is ready for your briefing. Sarah straightened her uniform, the crisp blue of the United Earth Defense Force, and checked her reflection in the polished metal of the corridor wall. At 52, she still carried herself like the fighter pilot she'd once been, but the weight of 3 years of ignored warnings had carved lines around her eyes that made her look older than her years. The Security Council chamber was a monument to human bureaucracy. Circular rows of seats arranged around a central holographic display, with representatives from every major colony world and corporate interest. As Sarah approached the podium, she could already see the skepticism in their faces. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne from the Scientific Directorate wore her usual expression of barely concealed condescension. Minister Chen Wei-lin from the Colonial Authority looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Admiral Rodriguez from Fleet Command kept glancing at his chronometer as if this were a waste of valuable time. Members of the Council, Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned their rank through fire and blood. I stand before you today to present evidence of a clear and present threat to human civilization. The holographic display activated, showing a 3-dimensional map of known space with human territories highlighted in blue. Red markers indicated the locations where colonies and ships had gone missing over the past 5 years. 47 settlements. Sarah continued. 16 commercial vessels, 8 exploration ships, and 1 heavy cruiser. All disappeared without trace. All in sectors that follow a clear pattern of expansion toward the galactic core. Dr. Hawthorne raised her hand. Admiral, with respect, we've been over this data before. Deep space is dangerous. Equipment failures, navigation errors, hostile environments. Any number of factors could explain these losses. Could they explain this? Sarah's fingers moved across the control interface, zooming in on the wreckage of the merchant vessel Prospector's Dream. The twisted metal gleamed under the chamber's lights, but it was the pattern of damage that made several council members lean forward in their seats. Those aren't micro-meteor impacts, Sarah said quietly. They're bite marks. The chamber erupted in murmurs of disbelief and concern. Minister Chen raised his voice above the noise. Admiral Chen, even if we accept your interpretation of this evidence, what exactly are you proposing? That we redirect our expansion efforts based on the possibility of some unknown threat? I'm proposing that we prepare for war. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Admiral Rodriguez was the first to break the silence. Admiral Chen, he said carefully, your service record is exemplary. No one questions your dedication to the defense of human space, but you're asking us to mobilize the entire fleet based on speculation and bite marks. Sarah had expected this response. For 3 years she had watched the bureaucrats and politicians bury their heads in the sand, refusing to see the approaching storm. But she had not spent those years idle. In the black sites and classified research facilities scattered across human space, she had been preparing for this moment. Then let me show you something that isn't speculation. The holographic display shifted, revealing a new image that made every person in the chamber fall silent. It was a recording from the emergency beacon of the heavy cruiser Indomitable, a Titan-class vessel that had disappeared 6 months ago while investigating distress signals from the Kepler 442 system. The footage was grainy, distorted by electromagnetic interference, but the massive shape moving across the screen was unmistakable. 9 feet tall, 4 arms, obsidian black carapace gleaming with alien light. The creature, for there was no other word to describe it, moved with fluid grace through the burning corridors of the cruiser, its claws casually rending through bulkheads that were designed to withstand direct nuclear strikes. "We managed to recover this from the beacon's black box memory core," Sarah said quietly. The Indomitable was a Titan-class heavy cruiser, 2 kilometers long, armor plating rated for extended combat operations. Armed with enough firepower to level a continent, it lasted 7 minutes. Dr. Hawthorne stared at the image with the horrified fascination of a scientist confronted with something that violated every assumption about the natural order. What is it?" "We call them hunters," Sarah replied. "And based on the pattern of disappearances, they've been moving steadily toward Earth for the past 5 years. Minister Chen's face had gone pale. "How long do we have?" Sarah looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of each council member in turn. These people held the fate of 8 billion human lives in their hands, and for the first time in 3 years they were finally listening. "Based on their rate of advance and the time between incidents," she said, "I estimate 18 months before they reach the Sol system. Maybe less." Admiral Rodriguez stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "If what you're saying is true, if these things are really out there, then we need to begin immediate mobilization. Every ship, every weapon, every defensive platform we can build." "It won't be enough," Sarah said quietly. The chamber fell silent again. Dr. Hawthorne was the first to speak. "What do you mean?" Sarah gestured to the tactical display, which now showed the estimated strength of a single hunter vessel compared to the entire United Earth Defense Force. The numbers were not encouraging. "Look at the data. 1 ship destroyed the Indomitable in 7 minutes. Our intelligence suggests they operate in fleets of dozens, possibly hundreds of vessels. Even if we mobilized every ship in human space, we'd be outnumbered and outgunned by orders of magnitude." "Then what do you suggest?" Minister Chen's voice was barely above a whisper. For the first time since entering the chamber, Sarah smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "We do what humans have always done when faced with a superior enemy," she said. "We learn, we adapt, and we make them regret the day they decided to hunt us." She reached into her jacket and withdrew a data chip, placing it on the podium with deliberate ceremony. "Project Lazarus," she announced. 18 months of classified research into hunter technology, biology, and tactics. Everything we've learned from the wreckage, the surveillance data, the specimens. Dr. Hawthorne leaned forward. "Specimens?" Sarah's smile grew wider, and several council members later remarked that it reminded them uncomfortably of a predator baring its teeth. 3 months ago, we captured one alive. In the deep black between stars, the hunter fleet moved with the patient inevitability of a plague. 73 vessels, each one a masterpiece of biomechanical engineering. Their hulls grown rather than built, their weapons powered by the neural energy of enslaved species. The fleet had been hunting for 700 years, and they had never encountered prey that could not be taken. But aboard the flagship Bone of Worlds, Velthak was beginning to suspect that this hunt would be different. His analysis of hunter communications traffic had revealed something unprecedented in the Scholar-cast databases. A species that not only knew it was being hunted, but was actively preparing to fight back. "High Huntress," he said carefully, approaching Zarathek's command throne, "I believe we may have underestimated these humans." Zarathek's 4 eyes remained fixed on the tactical display showing their approach to the Sol system. "They know we're coming. Their communication networks show massive military mobilization, resource reallocation, the construction of defensive platforms around their primary worlds. They're not fleeing or seeking to negotiate. They're preparing for war." "Curious," Zarathek mused. "Most species attempt diplomatic contact when they realize they've been marked for harvest. These humans seem to understand that such efforts would be futile." Crickstittle's laugh was like the grinding of tectonic plates. Let them prepare. What can primitives with chemical weapons do against the might of the eternal hunt? But Velthak's bioluminescent patterns were flickering with increasing agitation. Huntmaster, there's something else. We've lost contact with Scout Fleet 7. The command deck fell silent. Scout fleets did not simply disappear. They were fast, stealthy, nearly undetectable by primitive sensor systems. When Zarathek's voice had dropped to a deadly whisper, 14 rotations ago, they were conducting reconnaissance of the human outer colonies when their signals ceased. Zarathek was quiet for a long moment, her secondary eyes tracking movement patterns on screens that showed empty space. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note that Velithak had never heard before. Uncertainty. Perhaps, she said slowly. It's time we took a closer look at these children of Earth. As the Hunter fleet continued its inexorable advance toward the Sol system, none of them noticed the small, dark objects that had been trailing them for the past 3 days. Objects that moved without chemical exhaust or electromagnetic emissions. Objects that watched with electronic eyes and transmitted their observations across impossible distances using quantum entanglement. Objects built by human hands carrying a message that would change the course of galactic history. We see you. We're ready. And we're not afraid. The hunt was about to become something the Kethmori had never experienced in 700 years of dominance. A war between equals. But first they would need to learn why the children of Earth had earned their reputation as the most dangerous predators in known space. The Lazarus facility existed in the spaces between official documentation, a black site carved into the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Its location known to fewer than 30 people in all of human space. Admiral Sarah Chen stood before a reinforced observation window, watching the creature that had haunted her nightmares for the past 3 months. The Hunter, designated Subject 7 by the research team, paced within its containment cell with fluid grace that spoke of perfect biological engineering. Even restrained by neural dampeners and electromagnetic field generators powerful enough to hold a small star, it moved like liquid death incarnate. 9 feet of obsidian nightmare. 4 arms that could rend steel and eyes that held an intelligence that was both alien and terrifyingly familiar. It's been trying to establish communication, Dr. Sarah Martinez reported, her voice tight with exhaustion. The xenobiologist had been working 18-hour shifts since the capture, trying to decode the creature's bioluminescent patterns and vocalizations. The patterns are definitely linguistic in nature, but the complexity is extraordinary. Sarah didn't take her eyes off the Hunter as it suddenly stopped pacing and fixed all 4 of its eyes directly on her through the observation window. For a moment that stretched into eternity, woman and alien regarded each other across the barrier that separated prey from predator. Then the Hunter spoke. The words emerged from its throat in perfect unaccented English. You are the one they call Admiral Chen. The observation deck erupted in chaos. Dr. Martinez stumbled backward, her tablet clattering to the floor. Security personnel reached for weapons that would be useless against their prisoner. Only Sarah remained motionless, her eyes never leaving the alien's 4-eyed gaze. How do you know that name? She asked quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the intercom system. The Hunter's bioluminescent patterns pulsed in what might have been amusement. Your species broadcasts its thoughts across space with the subtlety of a stellar detonation. We have been listening to your communications for many cycles, learning your languages, studying your behaviors. You are fascinating creatures. Fascinating enough to spare? The alien's throat sacs inflated, the Kethmori equivalent of laughter, though the sound was like grinding stone. Spare? You misunderstand our nature, Admiral Chen. We do not spare. We harvest. We consume. We have done so for 700 of your years across 1,000 worlds. Your species is simply the next course in an eternal feast. Dr. Martinez had recovered enough to activate her recording equipment, her scientific training overriding her terror. Why? She asked. Why do you kill? What drives your species to this genocide? Subject 7's 4 eyes shifted to focus on the scientist, and for a moment its bioluminescent patterns dimmed to almost nothing. When it spoke again, its voice carried an emotion that was disturbingly human, sadness. Because we must, it said simply. Because the eternal hunt is not a choice but a compulsion written into our very genetics by those who came before. Because 10,000 cycles ago my people made a choice that damned them to hunger that can never be satisfied. Sarah leaned forward, her strategic mind immediately recognizing the importance of this revelation. Someone else made you into predators. The architects, Subject 7 confirmed. Beings of pure energy who sought to create the perfect biological weapon. They took my ancestors, peaceful herbivores on a world of endless grasslands, and transformed them into instruments of war. When their conflict ended, they abandoned us to the cosmos with only one imperative remaining: hunt or die. The observation deck fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. These creatures, these monsters that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries, were not naturally evolved predators, but manufactured weapons, tools discarded by their creators and left to fulfill their programming across eternity. "But you're speaking to us," Dr. Martinez said softly. "You're showing empathy, regret, that suggests your programming can be overcome." Subject 7's patterns flared brightly, and its 4 arms spread wide in what Sarah was beginning to recognize as a gesture of futility. Individual consciousness can resist the compulsion. Yes, but not for long. Even now I can feel the hunger growing. The need to hunt, to kill, to feed. Soon I will be nothing more than instinct and appetite once again. "How long?" Sarah asked. "Days, perhaps hours. The neural dampeners slow the process, but they cannot stop it entirely." Subject 7 moved closer to the observation window, its massive frame casting shadows that seemed to writhe with malevolent life. "Which is why I must tell you this, while I still can. The fleet that approaches your system is not the true threat. It is merely the vanguard of something far worse." The deck's environmental systems struggled to process the sudden increase in human perspiration and elevated heart rates. Sarah forced herself to remain calm, even as her mind raced through the strategic implications. "What do you mean?" "The Bone of Worlds carries 47 vessels, but following 3 days behind is the Death of Stars flagship of the Supreme Hunt Lord Krexvoot. 500 ships, Admiral. The largest fleet the Cathamori have assembled in 3 centuries. The Dr. Martinez made a strangled sound. 500 ships? But why? Why commit such overwhelming force to a single system? Subject 7's laugh was like breaking glass. "Because, Dr. Martinez, your species has done something unprecedented in our 700 years of hunting. You captured one of us alive, you resisted us. You showed no fear." Its voice dropped to a whisper that seemed to crawl along the walls, "and most disturbing of all, you have been hunting us back." In the command center of Luna Station, Admiral Rodriguez stared at the tactical display with the expression of a man watching his own execution. The Hunter fleet had dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system 12 hours ago, and their formation was like nothing in the tactical databases. Instead of the typical predatory advance pattern, they had arranged themselves in a defensive sphere around a single massive vessel at the center. "They're waiting for something," he said to the assembled staff officers. "The question is what?" Commander Lisa Park, the station's intelligence chief, highlighted several energy signatures on the display. "Sir, we're detecting massive communication bursts between the fleet and something beyond our sensor range. Whatever they're talking to, it's big." Sarah had arrived at Luna Station 6 hours ago, straight from the Lazarus facility, carrying intelligence that had turned their entire strategic picture upside down. The briefing she had given to the senior staff was still echoing in everyone's minds like a death sentence. 500 more ships," Rodriguez muttered, reviewing the data for the 20th time. "At current fleet strength, we might be able to take 47 in a straight fight. Maybe. But 500, he trailed off, unwilling to voice what everyone was thinking. "Sir," Captain Morrison from Fleet Operations spoke up hesitantly, "there is one possibility. The Aegis defense platform construction is ahead of schedule. If we could draw them into the inner system, make them come to us." "You're talking about turning Earth into a battlefield," Sarah said quietly. 8 billion people used as bait. "They're going to die anyway if we lose this fight," Morrison replied with brutal honesty. "At least this way they die fighting." Sarah was about to respond when alarms began echoing throughout the station. Commander Park's voice cut across the chaos. "Sir, new contacts dropping out of hyperspace. Multiple ships, unknown configuration, approaching from the galactic rim." The tactical display updated, showing 17 vessels that definitely weren't human but weren't hunter ships either. They were crystalline structures that seemed to sing with harmonic frequencies even across the vacuum of space, their hulls gleaming with internal light that pulsed in complex patterns. "Those are Velthari ships," Sarah breathed, recognizing the configuration from historical databases. "But that's impossible. The hunters wiped them out 300 years ago." The lead crystalline vessel transmitted on standard diplomatic frequencies, and the voice that emerged from the speakers was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Human fleet, this is Songkeeper Laurel of the Velthari Remnant. We come bearing urgent warning and offer of alliance." Rodriguez looked at Sarah with the expression of a man who had given up trying to understand the universe. "Admiral Chen, you're our expert on impossible things. What do you recommend?" Sarah was already moving toward the communications station. "Patch me through. Standard diplomatic protocols. But keep our weapons online." She took a deep breath and activated the transmitter. "Songkeeper Lyral, this is Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Earth Defense Force. State your intentions." The response came immediately, tinged with what sounded suspiciously like relief. "Admiral Chen, we have traveled many cycles to reach this system. We bear witness to your species' courage in facing the eternal hunt, and we come to offer what aid we can. But more importantly, we carry knowledge that may save not only your people but all free sentient life in the galaxy." "What knowledge?" "The secret of the architects. The beings who created the Kethmori as weapons of war. They have returned, Admiral, and they seek to reclaim their abandoned tools. If the Supreme Huntlord reaches your system with the death of stars, he will not simply harvest your worlds, he will use your people to feed an awakening that will consume every star in the galaxy." Sarah felt the universe shift around her as the true scope of the threat became clear. This wasn't just about human survival anymore. This was about the fate of all life in the cosmos. "Permission to come aboard," she said. "We need to talk." The Velthari transport that docked with Luna Station was a thing of impossible beauty, crystalline corridors that sang with harmonious frequencies, walls that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that conveyed emotion as much as information. Songkeeper Liral met Sarah at the airlock, and the alien's appearance was both familiar and utterly foreign. Where the hunters were predators incarnate, the Velthari were artists made manifest. Liral stood 7 feet tall, her crystalline body refracting light into rainbow patterns that shifted with her emotional state. Her face was vaguely humanoid, but her eyes were faceted gems that seemed to hold the depth of eternity. When she spoke, her voice created harmonies that touched something deep in Sarah's soul. "Admiral Chen," Lyral sang, "you honor us with your trust. Few organic species have ever been permitted aboard a Velthari vessel." "Organic species?" Sarah asked as they walked through corridors that seemed to grow around them with each step. "We were once biological beings, as you are now. But when the hunters came to our worlds 3 centuries ago, we made a choice that your people may soon face. We abandoned flesh and became one with our technology, preserving our consciousness in crystalline matrices that could survive the destruction of our bodies." They arrived at a chamber that defied human understanding of physics. A spherical room where gravity seemed optional and the walls displayed 3-dimensional star charts that updated in real time. Lyral gestured for Sarah to join her at the center of the room, where a holographic representation of the galaxy slowly rotated. "Observe," Lyral said, her voice taking on harmonics that made the display respond to her emotional state. 10,000 cycles ago, the galaxy was teeming with life. Thousands of species, millions of worlds, civilizations that had achieved wonders beyond your current imagination. The display shifted, showing the galaxy as it might have been, bright with the lights of countless civilizations, trade routes connecting distant worlds, a cosmic community that spanned the stars. "Then came the architects," Lyral continued, and the display darkened as malevolent red points of light began to spread like an infection. Beings of pure energy who existed in dimensions beyond normal space-time. They fought a war against something we can only call the void, entities that sought to consume reality itself. "The Kethmori were their weapons," Sarah said, understanding beginning to dawn. One of many, Lyrell confirmed. They created dozens of species to fight their war, biological weapons designed to consume entire star systems and convert the mass energy into forms they could use. When their conflict ended, most of these weapons were deactivated, but the Kethmori were too successful, too perfectly adapted to their purpose. The architects could not unmake them without risking their own destruction. The galaxy display showed the spread of red markers as the hunters expanded across space, consuming civilization after civilization. Sarah watched the light of sentient life slowly being extinguished, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's environmental systems. So they abandoned them, she said, with a compulsion that would keep them hunting until every trace of organic life was consumed. The architects retreated to their dimensional pocket to wait for the galaxy to be sterilized. Sarah's military mind immediately grasped the strategic implications, and now they're coming back to claim a universe empty of any species that might challenge them. Lyrell's crystalline form darkened with what Sarah was beginning to recognize as grief. 3 days ago, our deep space monitoring stations detected massive dimensional distortions at the galactic core. The architects are beginning to return, and the Supreme Hunt Lord has received new programming to accelerate the harvest and prepare for their arrival. How long do we have? If the death of stars reaches this system and begins the final harvest, perhaps 1 standard year before the architects complete their transition back to normal space-time. Sarah stared at the galaxy display, watching the slow march of red markers toward the blue point that represented Earth. 8 billion people, 16 colonies. The entire future of human civilization, all standing between an empty galaxy and something that wanted to unmake reality itself. What you're telling me, she said slowly, is that humanity is literally the last hope for all sentient life in the galaxy. Not just humanity. Lyrell corrected, her harmonics taking on notes of what might have been hope. Your species has done something unprecedented, Admiral. You captured one of the hunters. You learned their secrets. You prepared for war instead of seeking impossible peace. And most importantly, you showed them fear. Fear? For the first time in 700 cycles, the Kethmori have encountered prey that fought back effectively. The Supreme Hunt Lord's decision to bring such overwhelming force to your system is not just tactical. It is psychological. Your species has made them doubt their invincibility. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced since the dark days after the Titan incident. Hope. Dangerous. Irrational. Probably fatal hope. You said you came to offer aid. What kind of aid? Lyrell's form blazed with sudden light, and the chamber filled with harmonic frequencies that seemed to resonate in Sarah's bones. Knowledge. Admiral, the complete database of architect technology, including the control codes that could theoretically be used to override hunter programming, the construction specifications for weapons that exist partially outside normal space-time, and most importantly, the location of the architect's staging ground where they are preparing for their return. What do you want in exchange? Nothing, Lyrell said simply. We are already dead, Admiral. Our bodies were destroyed centuries ago, and our consciousness exists only as patterns of energy within crystalline matrices. But we remember what it was like to live, to hope, to dream of futures that stretched beyond mere survival. If your species can find a way to break the cycle, to defeat the hunters and prevent the architect's return, then perhaps those who come after will know the galaxy as it was meant to be, full of life, full of possibility. Sarah extended her hand, a gesture that meant nothing to an energy being inhabiting a crystalline matrix, but somehow seemed important anyway. Then let's get to work. We have a war to win and a universe to save. As their ships moved through the corridors of Luna Station, carrying technology and knowledge that would reshape human understanding of warfare itself, neither Sarah nor Lyrell noticed the small, dark objects that had been watching their meeting with electronic eyes, objects that transmitted their observations across impossible distances to a ship hanging motionless at the edge of the system. Aboard the Bone of Worlds, Hunt Master Crickstall studied the intercepted transmissions with growing unease. The humans had allied themselves with the Veltari remnant, survivors of a species that should have been extinct for 3 centuries. They possessed architect technology. They knew about the Supreme Hunt Lord's approach. But most disturbing of all, they were no longer behaving like prey. "Hide, Huntress," he rumbled, approaching Zarathek's command throne. "Perhaps it is time to begin the harvest immediately, before they can complete whatever preparations they are making." Zarathek's four eyes remained fixed on the tactical display showing human fleet movements. The primitives were repositioning their forces in patterns that looked almost professional. "No," she said quietly. "We wait for the death of stars. These humans have proven more resourceful than anticipated. We will not face them with anything less than overwhelming force." But even as she spoke, Zarathek could feel something she had never experienced in 700 years of hunting: uncertainty. The prey was preparing. The prey had allies. The prey had weapons and knowledge they should not possess. And somewhere in the deep black between stars, the death of stars continued its inexorable approach, carrying 500 ships and a Supreme Hunt Lord, whose programming had been updated with new imperatives from masters who existed beyond the normal flow of space and time. The children of Earth were about to face their greatest test, but they would not face it alone. The death of stars emerged from hyperspace like a wound torn in reality itself. 500 ships arranged in a formation that had consumed galaxies, their biomechanical hulls pulsing with stolen energy from 1,000 devoured worlds. At the fleet's heart, the Supreme Hunt Lord's flagship dwarfed even the massive dreadnoughts that surrounded it. 3 kilometers of living metal and nightmare architecture that had been grown rather than built. Supreme Hunt Lord Krexwith stood 12 feet tall, his carapace bearing scars from battles across 7 centuries of conquest. Unlike his subordinates whose bioluminescent patterns spoke of controlled aggression, Krexwith's entire body pulsed with a crimson radiance that seemed to drink light from the surrounding space. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that could shatter crystalline structures and drive weaker minds to madness. "Show me the primitives," he commanded, his forearms spreading wide as the tactical display materialized around him. The sight that greeted him was unprecedented in the long history of the Eternal Hunt. The human fleet had not fled. They had not scattered to the outer reaches of their system to prolong their inevitable doom. Instead, they had formed a defensive line between the hunter fleet and their homeworld, 200 ships arranged in a formation that spoke of tactical sophistication that should have been beyond their capabilities. But it was not the human ships that gave Krexwith pause. It was what surrounded them. Crystalline vessels that sang with harmonies that set his teeth on edge. Geometric constructs that existed partially outside normal space-time, their weapons channels glowing with energies that predated the current galactic cycle, and at the center of the formation a sight that sent primal terror racing through his enhanced nervous system, a ship that had been grown from architect technology, its hull inscribed with symbols that hurt to perceive directly. "Impossible," he breathed, his bioluminescent patterns flickering between rage and something dangerously close to fear. The Veltari were exterminated 3 centuries ago. The architect databases were sealed beyond any primitive species' ability to access. Intelligence Keeper Thexnal, the most sophisticated analytical mind the Katamori had ever produced, approached the command throne with data streams cascading across his neural interface. "Supreme Hunt Lord, our long-range sensors indicate the human vessel at the formation's center is broadcasting architect control frequencies. They appear to have accessed the foundational programming protocols." The command deck fell silent. Every hunter present understood the implications. If the humans had somehow gained access to architect control codes, they could theoretically override the compulsions that drove the eternal hunt. They could free the Katamori from 7 centuries of engineered hunger, or they could turn them into slaves. "Begin the approach," Krexwith ordered, his voice carrying overtones that made the ship's biomechanical systems respond with increased aggression. "Signal all vessels, no prisoners, no witnesses, no mercy. These primitives die today, and their secrets die with them." Aboard the human flagship Dauntless, a vessel that 3 months ago had been the exploration ship Endeavour before being rebuilt with technologies that violated several fundamental laws of physics, Admiral Sarah Chen watched the hunter fleet's approach with the calm of someone who had already accepted the impossibility of their situation. The ship's bridge was a fusion of human engineering and architect technology that shouldn't have been possible to create, let alone operate safely. Crystalline neural interfaces allowed human operators to think at quantum speeds, while biomechanical weapon systems responded to emotional states as much as tactical commands. At the center of it all, Subject 7, no longer restrained, no longer struggling against his programming, stood as living proof that the cycle could be broken. The hunter designated as Subject 7 had undergone a transformation that defied everything the research teams thought they knew about Kethmori biology. Exposure to architect control frequencies had not simply suppressed his hunting instincts. It had severed the neural pathways that connected his consciousness to the collective programming that drove his species. He was, perhaps for the first time in his existence, truly free. "Admiral," he said, his voice carrying none of the predatory undertones that had marked their previous conversations. "The death of stars is broadcasting command imperatives to my former fleet. Krexavuth is attempting to override individual consciousness entirely, to reduce every hunter to nothing more than an extension of his will." Sarah nodded, watching the tactical display as the hunter formation began to shift into attack patterns that had terrorized the galaxy for 7 centuries. "Can you counter it?" "Perhaps, but the process will require—" Subject 7 paused, his bioluminescent patterns flickering with what Sarah had learned to recognize as uncertainty. "Admiral, what I am about to attempt has never been done before. If I succeed, I will be broadcasting override codes across the entire hunter fleet. Some will break free, as I have. Others will resist, and the conflict between their programming and their consciousness may damage them permanently. And if you fail, then I will likely die, and you will face 500 ships with the tactical sophistication of a single mind guiding them all." Sarah looked around the bridge at the faces of her crew, young men and women who had volunteered for a mission that was essentially elaborate suicide. They had spent 3 months learning to interface with technology that existed partially outside normal spacetime, training for a battle that would determine the fate of not just humanity but all life in the galaxy. "Subject 7, she said quietly. "What's your real name? Not your designation, not your title, your name." The hunter's patterns dimmed to almost nothing, and when he spoke, his voice carried an emotion that Sarah was only beginning to understand: gratitude. "I am Velshar, which in your language would translate roughly to one who remembers. I remember the world where my ancestors grazed beneath twin suns. I remember the songs they sang before the architects came. I remember what it was like to feel joy instead of hunger. Then help us remember what it's like to hope, Velshar. Help us show them that the cycle can be broken." Velshar moved to the crystalline control interface at the bridge center, his 4 hands moving across controls that responded to thought as much as touch. Around them, the ship's biomechanical systems began to hum with frequencies that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond normal space. "All ships," Sarah announced across the fleet communication network. "This is Admiral Chen. In 30 seconds, we're going to do something that has never been attempted before. We're going to offer our enemies a choice: break free from their programming and live, or remain slaves and die. Whatever happens, remember that we fight not just for humanity, but for every species that has ever looked up at the stars and dreamed of something better." She paused, watching as the hunter fleet continued its approach, their weapons powering up with energies that could crack planets. "Today we show the galaxy what the children of Earth are capable of. All ships engage." The Battle of Sol began not with weapons fire, but with something far more dangerous. Hope broadcast as electromagnetic radiation across frequencies that touched the deepest levels of consciousness itself. Velshar's 4 hands danced across the architect control interface, and suddenly the space between the fleets filled with cascading patterns of light and sound that spoke directly to the neural architecture of every hunter ship. For the first time in 7 centuries, the compulsions that drove the eternal hunt faced something they had never encountered: a choice. Aboard the Bone of Worlds, Zarathek staggered as competing imperatives tore through her consciousness like opposing gravitational fields. The hunger that had defined her existence for over 2 centuries suddenly faced an alternative: the possibility of peace, of choosing her own path, of remembering what her people had been before the architects made them into weapons. Around her, the ship's crew began to convulse as their programming conflicted with their awakening individual consciousness. Some collapsed, their minds unable to process the contradiction. Others began to scream as memories of slaughtered worlds collided with the sudden understanding of what they had become. But some, perhaps 1 in 10, simply stopped. They stood motionless for a moment, their bioluminescent patterns shifting from the aggressive reds of the hunt to colors that had not been seen among the Kethmori for millennia, blues of contemplation, greens of growth, the gold of wonder. "Hide Huntress," one of them said, and Zarathek was shocked to realize it was Huntmaster Crixtal, his voice now carrying harmonics she had never heard before. "I remember now. I remember the songs our ancestors sang before the hunger took us. I remember what it was like to create instead of destroy." But even as parts of the hunter fleet began to break free from their programming, others doubled down on their aggressive imperatives. The death of stars itself remained under Krexovit's absolute control, its massive weapons beginning to charge with energies that could sterilize entire planets. The Supreme Hunt Lord's voice boomed across all frequencies, carrying compulsions so powerful that several human crew members collapsed from the psychic pressure. "Destroy the primitives. Silence the singers. The eternal hunt must not be denied." 130 hunter ships broke free from their formation, their crews awakening to consciousness for the first time in centuries. But 370 others remained under Krexvit's control, their weapons locking onto human targets with predatory precision. The real battle was about to begin. Sarah watched the tactical display as the hunter fleet split into two forces, allies and enemies separated by choices that would echo across the galaxy. The free hunters immediately began engaging their still enslaved kin, their weapons fire creating spectacular light shows as biomechanical energy met crystalline shields. "All human vessels," she announced, "target the ships still broadcasting aggressive command frequencies. Let our new allies handle their own people. We have bigger problems." The death of stars was moving now, its massive bulk accelerating toward Earth with the inexorable momentum of a falling moon. Its weapons, energy cannons that drew power from enslaved star cores, began to fire, and space itself seemed to burn as beams of concentrated destruction lanced across the void. The human defensive line held for exactly 17 seconds. The first wave of hunter fire tore through human shields like tissue paper, and 12 ships died in the first exchange. But as the wreckage dispersed, the surviving vessels began to return fire with weapons that defied everything the hunters thought they knew about primitive technology. Crystalline beam arrays that existed partially outside normal space-time phased through hunter armor and disrupted their biomechanical systems from within. Quantum torpedoes collapsed local space-time, creating gravitational anomalies that crushed enemy vessels into singularities, and at the center of it all, the Dauntless unleashed weapons that had been built from architect specifications. Devices that turned mass directly into energy and fired concentrated streams of creation itself. But for every hunter ship that fell, 2 more pressed forward. The death of stars was less than an hour from Earth orbit, and its massive size meant that its weapons could begin bombarding the planet from much farther away than anyone had anticipated. "Admiral," reported Commander Park from the tactical station, "at current engagement rates, we'll be overwhelmed in 37 minutes. The flagship is just too big, too heavily armed." Sarah was about to respond when new contacts appeared on the edge of the system, not ships but something far stranger. Massive crystalline structures that sang with harmonies audible across the vacuum of space, their faceted surfaces reflecting light from dimensions that existed beyond normal perception. "Velthari world singers." Lyral's voice rang across the communication channels, her harmonics now backed by the combined consciousness of an entire civilization that had chosen to become something beyond flesh. "We sing the death of tyrants and the birth of hope. We sing the memory of what was and the promise of what could be." The crystalline structures, each one the size of a small moon, began to resonate with frequencies that touched the quantum foundations of reality itself. Space-time started to ripple around the hunter fleet, as the Velturi world singers used their combined consciousness to rewrite local physics. Suddenly, the biomechanical weapons of the enslaved hunters began to malfunction as their energy frequencies were shifted into harmonic patterns that disrupted their targeting systems. Ships that had been accelerating toward Earth found themselves moving backward through space, as the world singers reversed local gravitational fields. But even the power of an ascended civilization could not stop the death of stars entirely. Krexvit's flagship pressed forward through the quantum distortions. Its massive size and architect-enhanced systems allowing it to resist effects that crippled smaller vessels. 1 hour to Earth orbit, Sarah announced across all channels. All ships, all allies. This is our last chance. If that thing reaches our homeworld, 8 billion people die and the architects get exactly what they want. She looked at Velshar, whose bioluminescent patterns were now cycling through colors that spoke of hope, determination, and something that might have been love for a species he had never been allowed to know as anything other than prey. "Can you reach the Supreme Hunt Lord?" she asked. "Can you break through his programming the way you broke through your own?" Velshar's patterns dimmed as he considered the question. "Perhaps. But Admiral, what I would be attempting is not just breaking individual conditioning. It would be severing the connection between the most powerful hunter consciousness and the collective programming that has driven our species for 7 centuries. The psychological shock might destroy his mind entirely. And if it doesn't, then for the first time since the architects abandoned us to the void, the Kethemori will be truly free to choose their own destiny." Sarah looked around the bridge one final time at the faces of people who had volunteered to stand between Earth and annihilation, young and old, military and civilian, human and alien, united by the simple belief that some things were worth dying for. "Do it," she said. "Give them the choice." The final transmission from the Dauntless carried more than just electromagnetic radiation. It carried the hope and determination of every conscious being who had ever looked up at stars and refused to accept that might made right. Velshar's consciousness, augmented by architect neural interfaces and backed by the combined will of the entire Allied fleet, reached across space to touch the mind of Supreme Hunt Lord Krexavuth. What passed between them in that moment was not communication in any conventional sense, but a direct transfer of memory, emotion, and possibility. Krexavuth staggered as alien concepts flooded his consciousness. The memory of grass beneath twin suns, the sound of laughter instead of screams, the possibility that strength could be used to protect rather than destroy. For 7 centuries, he had been the perfect weapon, the ultimate predator, the living embodiment of the eternal hunt. But beneath all that programming, buried under layers of artificial compulsion and engineered hunger, was the consciousness of a being who had once stood beneath alien stars and felt wonder instead of need. The death of stars suddenly lurched to a halt, its massive weapons powering down as Krexavuth's conflicted commands propagated through its biomechanical systems. Across the ship, Hunter crew members collapsed as their Supreme Hunt Lord's psychic emanations shifted from compulsion to chaos, to something that had not been felt aboard a Kethemori vessel in 700 years' peace. When Krexavuth finally spoke, his voice carried across all frequencies with a tone that no hunter had ever heard from their supreme leader: wonder. "I remember," he said, his massive form trembling as memories flooded back through genetic archives that predated the architect modifications. "I remember the first song our people sang when they learned to look beyond their homeworld and dream of touching the stars not as conquerors but as explorers. The death of stars began to turn away from Earth, its massive bulk moving with a grace that spoke of choice rather than compulsion. Throughout the fleet, enslaved hunters dropped their weapons as Krexavuth's liberation echoed through their collective consciousness like a wave of freedom breaking across 7 centuries of bondage. But victory carried a price that none of them had anticipated. In the deep black beyond the galactic rim, sensors registered the quantum distortions that marked the hunters' mass awakening. Entities that existed partially outside normal spacetime observed the breaking of bonds that they had forged with the fundamental forces of creation itself. The architects were no longer content to wait for their biological weapons to complete their work. They were coming home. Sarah stood on the observation deck of Luna Station 6 months later, watching as human and Kethemori engineers worked together to repair damage from the Battle of Sol. The sight would have been impossible to imagine a year ago. Predator and prey collaborating on projects that benefited both species. The galaxy was changing. Word of the hunters' liberation had spread across the surviving civilizations like wildfire, and for the first time in centuries, species that had hidden in the dark spaces between stars began to emerge. The Veltafari remnant was teaching other races to transcend the limitations of flesh. Free hunters were using their knowledge of biomechanical engineering to heal worlds they had once ravaged. Humanity's gift for adaptation and innovation was spreading through trade routes that had been abandoned for generations. But the sensor readings from deep space told a different story. The architects were indeed returning, and they were not pleased with their weapons' newfound independence. Admiral Velshar said, approaching her with data tablets that contained intelligence reports from across the galaxy. Our scouts have detected massive energy signatures at 17 different dimensional breach points. The architects are not coming back in small numbers. Sarah nodded, having expected this development since the day they broke the Hunters' programming. How long do we have? Perhaps 2 standard years before they complete their transition to normal space-time, maybe less if they decide to accelerate the process. Sarah looked out at the ships moving through solar system space, human vessels working alongside crystalline Belteri world singers, and biomechanical hunter craft. An alliance that spanned species, philosophies, and forms of existence itself. Then we'd better get ready, she said. The children of Earth aren't done growing up yet. In the distance, a new class of vessel was taking shape in the orbital shipyards. Ships designed not by any single species, but by the combined knowledge of civilizations that had chosen cooperation over conquest. They incorporated human adaptability, Velthere transcendence, Kethmori biomechanical mastery, and technologies reverse-engineered from architect databases. The architects were returning to reclaim a galaxy they expected to find empty and compliant. Instead, they would face something that had never existed before in the cosmos. A true alliance of free peoples who had learned that the strongest force in the universe was not hunger or compulsion, but the choice to stand together against the dark. The children of Earth had taught the galaxy how to hope. Now they would all learn together whether hope was enough to challenge the beings who had shaped reality itself to serve their will. But that would be a story for another day. For now, it was enough that the stars were no longer silent, that the hunt had ended, and that somewhere in the vast cosmos, consciousness had chosen compassion over conquest. The universe was no longer empty. It was full of possibilities. And the children of Earth, along with all their new family among the stars, were ready to defend every single one of them.